Hi, I'm Seamless, and yesterday I made a video about how to make money as a producer. It's a very vague kind of concept, suggesting various types of revenue streams that a producer can engage in to sort of make money. And one of the things I didn't really talk about was labels. And I don't usually talk about labels, and this is because my opinion of labels is that they're not super necessary in the grand scheme of things, mostly because of the idea that you can actually have all these other revenue streams more or less on your own. More or less. It's not exactly that simple, but it's a lot simpler than most people think it is. The label thing, though, because somebody had a question about like a label approach them because they want to do an EP, and here's they give me a deal. Is this deal good or bad? Whatever. How does this work? What's up with that? So I'm going to discuss a little bit about the label life and what that means, and if it applies to you or not is actually pretty much up to you. It's not in and of itself good or bad. It is, however, can be good or bad for you. Anyway, so the most basic thing, like this particular individual who asked about the deal that he got, said that he got offered a 50-50 split, which sounds fair, doesn't it? Half and half kind of thing. And this is something, there's two parts of the thing you have to think about. The first part is that a lot of people don't have it in their heads that they can negotiate things. You can negotiate stuff. You can make counter offers and that kind of thing. And I know that actually, very in particular in newer generations, is not really a common thing to think about because you're used to sort of seeing stuff as being what it is and then going for what it is and not really questioning it. But in terms of this very individual enterprise where you are yourself your own enterprise, you can make the rules essentially. And you can get deals from people, and I mean, they might not accept it, but they might also accept it. So, like, the 50-50 deal kind of sounds good, because if you think about it, you're sort of like, cool, I make the music and then you sell it, that kind of thing. But you kind of think about that the effort involved in these two things are not necessarily equal. And you also have to think about that the label is dealing with however many other artists they have on the label, and if it's an electronic label, it's probably as many as they can get their hands on. And that's how they make money, is the idea that, like, sure, they got a 50-50 deal with you, but they got 50-50 deals with 30 other people. So they make assuming they're not a dumb label, they're kind of making some money on that. That's the plan anyway. It doesn't really always work out that way. And so you gotta sort of keep that in mind when you're trying to weigh the value of your work versus their work. And other than that, though, let's run some numbers. Let's run some theoretical numbers here about what that actually means. Because one of the things I don't really like about the ideas of labels as being a necessity is that now more than ever, and increasingly so day by day, it is a lot easier for an individual musical artist to sell their own stuff. And, I mean, the actual act of putting it up somewhere to sell, because Bandcamp exists, that kind of thing, is pretty easy. The hard part is the distribution and building a following and that kind of thing. The problem with that, though, is that that's still the hard part for labels. Like, a good label that has value these days is somebody who can do that. Somebody who has the ability to promo and to further your brand and raise awareness. And you can do this in a number of ways, and most direct and easy way is to have contacts with, like, promo channels on YouTube for music, so you upload your stuff everywhere, like get radio play or something like that. Get interviews and blogged and that kind of stuff. All these podcasts and mixes and so many of these things, and you can actually build these contacts, those specific contacts, on your own if you work at it hard enough, and eventually you can even have a bit of an infrastructure that rivals that of a label. And that's often how a lot of labels start. In fact, the label I'm signed to, Fixed, initially wasn't really a label. However, it was an infrastructure that was designed initially to further Celldweller's career. And then when they realized that they could do that and that it was successful, they decided to open up them doing that as a service to other people. And that's how the label of Fixed and their promo company became a thing. So that's something to keep in mind if you ever thought about that. But let's run some numbers. So let's say you have an EP. Let's say you sell it for $10, which, but let's just say, because 10's a nice even round number. Before you even get to the point where you're doing half and half, you have, depending on where you're selling the track, you have to take the split from the distribution. One of the reasons why when I am promoting, like, my own music that I sell, I usually link it directly to the Fixed actual store. And the big reason for that is because they don't pay distribution overhead like they do with iTunes, for example. iTunes takes, I think, a 30% cut. Most people are going to use iTunes. So, iTunes, Amazon, any of those people, that kind of stuff. I actually don't really buy a lot of music, so I don't really know. But as a consumer how that works out. But there's a lot of options for that. Most people are also probably just going to go to Spotify and just listen to it from there. That's fine. That's whatever. But if they actually buy it, it's going to probably be from somewhere like Google Music that has some kind of cut, and it's usually a percentage. It's usually 30%. So you sell a copy, $10 copy, 30% right there. So that means that the split that you're going to get is a split of $7. So now that you're splitting your $7 between you and the label, you get $3.50 for your $10 EP. So one thing right off the bat to consider is that, sure, if a label does a good job, they're going to sell more copies, they're going to move more things, which even before the money has a particular value because you're getting your name out, and that's totally cool. But you got to sell almost 3 times as many copies for you to make as much money as if you would have sold it by yourself. And if that matters to you, then that should be a thing you think about. So the idea that, like, cool, if I sold 300 copies on a label, that would be as much money coming to me as if I had sold 100 copies by myself. Although that's kind of a lot, selling hundreds of copies. I don't even think I've sold hundreds of copies of, like, my last EP. Although it's been a while, so I probably have. I haven't checked it in a bit. Then the other part of that is recouping expenses. So there are expenses, and this is legit. Like, this is, you when I describe this to you, you're going to think that, like, the labels are trying to shaft you. They're not trying to shaft you. This is just the cost of business. The expenses are things like if they do art for you or if they do mastering for you, which really, guys, do your own mastering. They don't care. The labels do not care. As long as it doesn't sound like ass, that's fine. Like, a lot of people have this idea that labels have some sort of extremely high quality demand. Some labels do. Like, Monster Cat is pretty famous about rejecting people based on mixed quality and, like, having come back and forth or whatever. Although I don't believe they offer their own mastering service, but they do. They're pretty picky about it. But most labels are not, especially labels that, like, come to you. Like, if you're big enough that Monster Cat comes to you to make an EP, then, like, this discussion doesn't need to happen because you're doing pretty good. But for the most part, the kind of labels that are going to come to you and offer you deals out of the blue are going to be new labels, small labels, labels that probably are not going to do as good a job as labels that are like 4 times their size. In fact, a lot for me personally, before I was even signed to Fixed, I was getting offers left and right from labels that were like 1/4 the size of me already. And that's just why I didn't take any of them, because they could not possibly offer me any value in terms of like spreading my name and getting me out there. In fact, it'd be more like they were signing to me. So, and here's the thing, if I were smart about that, if I were like taking my own advice that I'm giving right now, what I would have done is I would have just negotiated extremely one-sided deals for me. Like, maybe get an 80-20 split. That kind of thing. That would have been at least a little bit valuable, because that just would have been almost like I just had my own storefront at that point. And just, sure, they're being related to me, but I'm still getting more per sale than what I would have gotten, with any other label. Although I could have also just gone to Bandcamp and done that, and that would have been probably just as good in that particular sort of environment. Not necessarily with what Fix could do, by the way. Yeah, so the kind of expenses are stuff like the art mastering, the cost of putting it up on the distribution, cost of promo, whatever it is that they do. They pay off blogs or something, and I don't even know what, but they do that. They have money, and if they're not assholes, what they'll probably do is that you will recoup 50% of that. So like they pay for half of that, and then you pay for half of that, because everything's 50-50. And that's the kind of deal that I have with Fixed, is that I pay for half of the expenses. Thing is, though, is that until that expenses are paid, you do not get paid money. You don't get paid for the stuff that you sell that you get back. And like, the bummer about that is that the biggest push, the biggest amount of like return and sales you're going to see on an EP is right when it comes out. And you're probably, for the most part, it's pretty rare for new unknown artists to ever make their money back on like their initial offering and that kind of thing. And like, if you consider that, and the idea that, like, you remember the whole sell 3 times as many copies as you need to if you're just doing it by yourself, it is really often a lot easier and a lot better just to do it on your own and just kind of build it slowly over time. Like, because it does build. Every individually new person that you manage to, like, convert to liking and buying your music is somebody that is more likely to do so the next time you put out a new EP. Because it's never really about the individual EP. It's about your overall brand, which assumes future content. And then you have more content, you have more things to buy. Because look at Savant. Savant has like so many albums. And so someone finds out who he is for the first time, and like they just have, it's just overwhelming with how many things they could buy and that kind of thing. And this is something, I mean, he's involved with Section Z and whatever, but he wasn't always. And that's something to consider. Now, that, like, the thing about labels, and this is, I briefly mentioned this in the last video, the advice that BT gave me, which was that you don't really need to involve yourself with labels unless they can do something that you can't, which if you're unknown, that's kind of a lot, just because your abilities are, in terms of advertising and distribution and producing, or not producing, but producing, advertising, that kind of thing, are zero. And theirs are non-zero. So it doesn't matter if they're crappy, they're just still better than you. But, like, if your goal is to kind of try and get out there, you may be a little bit more likely to do so with a label, but these are still things you can do. It just takes you longer. And if you're in a hurry, then yeah, okay, cool, do that. But I was always worried about, like, so when I come from the metal world, and in the metal world, there's not this kind of quote unquote Facebook, this quote unquote label whoring that happens, where artists just like do an EP on this label and then do an EP on that label and then are kind of around or whatever. Like, that's just sort of how they roll. In the metal world, you pick a label and you're on that label, and then they get you. You're on it, and that's it. And a lot of that is because recording and producing like band music is a lot more expensive than just EDM stuff. And so labels need to like hardcore make sure that their investment is going to stay their investment. But like the kind of investment that like EDM labels make in just like promo and just putting out an EDM track is so infinitesimal in comparison. So it doesn't particularly matter. But when I was entering into the EDM scene, I still had the metal band kind of idea in my head, and I just never wanted to be, a slave to a single label, because like I have. And almost everything that I do, I want to be independent. I want to be able to rely on my own abilities to make a living versus relying on a label's ability to make me a living. Because then I don't really have control over that. I can't personally make it better. And if I do personally make it better, it's just it's probably going to benefit more them than it would benefit me. And this has to do with the other video about having all different kinds of revenue streams and the sample packs and t-shirts and merch in general, and mixing mastering services, and any possible thing that you could possibly do it yourself to, again, alleviate pressure from how much you need to, say, sell music. Because any one of those things, trying to make enough money from any single one, is really, really hard. But you can. It's mostly a matter of time. It's also a matter of not sucking, because if you suck, then that's just going to be a problem forever. But, like, it's also, a lot of people have it in their mind that, like, make good music and people will find it. And that might be true, but they might not pay for it. That's a different thing entirely. But yeah, this is mostly just about labels. And my overall opinion on labels is that if you can avoid using them, fucking avoid using them. Do it yourself, build your own brand, and, like, be confident in that. Like, and a lot of people would do this, and this is the thing that will occur to them to do so, but they have it in their heads that being on a label is required if you want to make any kind of money, if you want to have notoriety, if you want to succeed. And that might have been the case 20 years ago, but that is super not the case anymore. And like, as I described earlier, labels have abilities to do things for other people, but those are abilities that you yourself can create for yourself. That's really all there is to that. But yeah, it's mostly about the numbers thing. The numbers thing is a thing that people don't really think about a lot. And like, you can, like I said, negotiate to get better numbers. Just be like, no, I'm not going to do that for that month for 50-50. I need at least 70-30, that kind of thing. And you might think that like a label will be able to scoff at that and just be like, well, that's kind of a crappy deal based on what I just said, because that would mean that they get like 90 cents or something on a sale. But remember, they have other clients. They have other artists that probably have worse deals than that. And sure, the worse the deal is for them, like, the better you need to be for them. And like, they'll consider this. And like, because if you're like a nobody, you're just like, no, 90-10 for me, and they're gonna be like, no, and that kind of thing. Although, the art of negotiating and haggling is that, you start high and then they negotiate lower, and then you get what you actually wanted, which was something more reasonable. But I don't do that, because that's a Personal problem. I don't really like haggling, but some people do. Some people are really good at it, and maybe you are. Maybe that's a thing you can do. So just have that in mind when you're thinking about like a label thing as well. And here, if you want to talk about like label efficiency, here's a nice little thought experiment. Go and find the biggest label that you know, that you like, that you follow, that has all the artists that you like, and go look at their artist roster and see how many artists are on that label that you just never heard of, that you in no way had any idea that they were like even an artist, let alone on that label. And you'll discover like, the point of doing this is that those people who you don't know about are either people who aren't as good and thus not as like, you know, well known, or people who are new and thus also not as well known because that label didn't do a super good job of pushing them. And there are other factors to be considered about in that as well, but that's a big part of that. That's a big part of why you don't know who they are. And like, and when you're imagining being on a label, don't imagine yourself as being the most successful artist on the label. Imagine yourself being the most unsuccessful artist on that label, because honestly, when you start out, you are going to be. So imagine you have to find out how they treat and how those particular artists are presented, and just that's going to be your life if you're on that label. So that's a good thing to do. Keep in mind all this stuff. If you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day. One thing though, like there's a lot of really nitty gritty specifics about like terms and words inside like actual label contracts, but there's already a lot of resources out there. Just Google label contracts, and you'll find so many blogs and people who are like dissecting and telling you what each thing means and whatever. But for the most part, what we just discussed is kind of like the top level amount of stuff that matters. There's a bunch of other things like signing away publishing rights, signing away the masters, you know, what kind of like credit you have and like what kind of licensing they're allowed to do versus what you're allowed to do. And it does matter because, for example, I'm signed exclusively to Fixed because one of the things that they do is that they have a lot of contacts in the movie, film, and gaming licensing scene. And this means that if I want to have my stuff to be able to be in that pool of things that they can do, I have to give them 100% of the publishing, and they have to own the masters. And like, they're still giving me my cut on the music or whatever, but I actually technically don't own those tracks anymore. And the whole reason for that is because like, what film studio, for example, would ever make a trailer for a song that like at any moment I would be like, nope, never mind, and then that would be gone forever. They would not do that. So in order to negotiate those kinds of deals, it's a very specific, special thing to do. However, that kind of hardcore signing away your work and that sort of thing is almost completely unnecessary in traditional label relationships with just selling music. So if they ever tell you that they're going to do that, fucking don't. But do research about what that means, about what contracts say, and about what they're talking about. And there are lots and lots and lots of people, mostly from the metal community, who will tell you gladly what all that stuff means. And they probably have in some stuff on Google. I actually had a college course on this, so it was elective. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.